In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, we would like to welcome you in the fourth session entitled Energy Security in the Gulf, Threats and Prospects. Today we are sorry to tell you that one of the speakers will not be able to attend, so there are two speakers that will take the floor today. Nicolai Cousineau, in addition to Dr. Alanoud Al-Khalifa, and Professor Alanoud Al-Khalifa will be talking about energy security and nuclear projects in the GCC states, and Mr. Nikolay about the Russian-Saudi dialogue and the future of OPEC. So the speakers have 10 extra minutes, and now we'll start with Professor Alanoud. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, first and foremost, I would like to welcome you all and to seize this opportunity and to thank the organizers of the 6th Annual Gulf Studies Forum for having given us the opportunity to share our paper with you entitled Energy Security and Nuclear Projects in the GCC States. Energy security is something that is very interesting and important to the GCC Council. However, it is facing internal and external challenges in what concerns energy security, especially in challenges related to the transformations in the production of global energy. So GCC states are not able to adopt the same mechanisms because of the fluctuations in the prices of oil, because of the higher demands on energy, because of the economic and political atmosphere and environment that is not stable, pushes the GCC member states to deploy extra efforts in this framework. And we can say that they are seeking to reach sustainable development that takes into account the environmental demands. So the GCC Council, through its strategic vision, national strategic vision, also is deploying efforts in order to be able to reach the highest level of energy security and invest in alternatives to have diversified sources of energy. And the GCC Council is also seeking to reinforce national security. And in order to reach this objective, member states listed nuclear energy in the framework of energy security, and this gives an extra option in what concerns the desalination of water. And we can say that this paper asked many questions. What is the strategic need of a GCC Council to develop peaceful programs of the energy or nuclear energy, and to which extent the Iranian nuclear program and the challenges it presents affects the Gulf states. In addition to this, so what are the challenges of programs like those, and what are the arrangements of nuclear safety adopted by the GCC Council? These questions push us to raise a very important question. Can we say that peaceful energy programs will raise national energy in the GCC, energy security in the GCC member states? Of course, we will be delving into all of these details throughout this presentation. So my presentation is divided into 4 main parts. The first part focuses on the concept of energy security in general, in what concerns how it started and its definition. The second part focuses on the concept of energy security from the point of view of the GCC Council, and the last 2 parts focused on the position of the GCC Council and how it has been focusing on peaceful nuclear programs, in addition to the dangers that this presents. So it's very important to say here that there are different aspects that have been covered in this paper. Energy security has a lot of definitions. Each country, each state defines energy security from its own point of view. And of course, in the first part, this has been discussed in details, but as the World Bank mentioned, the capacity of the countries to guarantee to produce and to use energy at a logical cost in a sustainable manner, in addition to the contribution to the economic growth, to put an end to poverty and to facilitate the access to the services of modern energy. This is energy security. And in order to achieve energy security, this requires global and local cooperative efforts, and energy security also can cover three main aspects: the environment, the political, and other sectors as well. So it was very important for us to measure these three different aspects. Energy security, of course, links energy to sustainable development, to economic growth, and to political situation. Regarding energy security in the Arab Gulf, we know that GCC countries depend on oil and gas in order to produce energy, and they are a main source of the revenues of exports. However, there is no guarantee of energy security on the long term. And there are lots of developments in the market of oil. The prices of oil fluctuate and depend on the geostrategic changes in the Middle East. Therefore, there is a high need for Middle Eastern countries and Gulf countries to diversify the sources of energy. GCC countries are deploying efforts in order to focus on nuclear energy and to use it as an alternative energy. In the year 2006, the GCC Council asked the member states to conduct a common study to launch a common program that focuses on nuclear energy according to the international principles and standards. The GCC decision goes hand in hand with the global orientation. So 1 ton of uranium can create energy that can result from millions of tons of other sources of energy. So this can create around this can create electricity, and therefore GCC countries are seeking to add nuclear energy as part of the portfolio of energy that it adopts. So GCC member states are considered among the higher consumers of electricity and desalinated water because of the high demographic growth, and the GCC member states started signing lots of agreements with other countries in order to produce nuclear programs, taking into account the principles that are adopted by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So there's a decision that was taken in order to establish 4 reactors at the value of $20 billion in order to serve around 25% of the needs of electricity of the United Arab Emirates. This, of course, decreases the demand on gas. In May 2012, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia also said that it is seeking to develop 16 nuclear reactors, and this of course should be done by 2040, and signed cooperation agreements with France, Russia, and South Korea and Argentina. The rest member states took the same measures in what concerns cooperation in nuclear energy. So Bahrain signed with the United States of America, Qatar with France, the state of Kuwait a cooperation agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And in order to confirm these different intentions, the Department of Scientific and Technical Cooperation said that it will be cooperating with the IAEA in order to launch different programs in this field. We are still talking about the fact that GCC member states are seeking to focus more and more on nuclear energy. In fact, the nuclear programs of GCC member states might not only focus on the diversification of energy, however, it might have a political dimension that is non-declared. This can guarantee a strategic balance of GCC member states, especially that at the regional level there was no stability in the last couple of years. So GCC member states consider the peaceful nuclear program as a tool to use to maneuver against Iran that started developing its nuclear programs, and therefore GCC countries are seeking to develop these nuclear programs to face any Iranian risks and hazards. And Iran, if it continues to develop its nuclear programs, this might lead to a confrontation that might destabilize the Middle East. In fact, the introduction of nuclear energy in the Gulf constitutes a problem because many people think that there might be a race to use the uranium for military purposes, and therefore it is very clear that this might have a negative impact as well, and not only a positive impact on GCC member states. And there are as well security consequences. So programs or nuclear programs face other challenges, like the fact of the lack of experience and trainings, because there are no experts and scientists who can work on operating such stations, because the operation of such stations require around 18 years, and this might constitute a big problem to GCC countries because this structure is non-existent for different factors, like the lack of people. We might see this in United Arab Emirates because there is a reactor, or the opening of a reactor was delayed 3 times because of trainings. The United Arab Emirates, in order to GCC countries, do not have or did not have beforehand any nuclear culture and knowledge, and therefore such a development requires a long time and is at a high cost. And in addition to this, it is expected for these costs to increase in comparison with other sources of energy. There was a study that was conducted by experts on nuclear energy, and that showed that the current costs of third-generation reactors will be higher in the year 2030, and the study also expected for the next generation of nuclear generation, so the 4th generation, will be at a higher cost. And if we compare the cost of nuclear programs to other sources of energy, like renewable energy, there is also a Saudi study on the economies of nuclear energy, and that concluded that the making energy might face lots of challenges, or creating energy. So solar panels since 2009 started reducing to around 75%, and it is expected for those to continue decreasing. Regarding the last part that focuses on the risks of energy security, what I want to point out is that the usage of nuclear energy is not only related to risks, but also to the nature of this danger that is different from any other sources of energy, and therefore when incidents on the level of reactors leads to leakages, the consequences might be really difficult. This might lead to the pollution of the environment, and there are different examples that show this, like the region around the Chernobyl area, and this is something that is not acceptable here in the Gulf area, taking into account the condition and the fact that there is no political stability in the Middle East, and we can say that there is an ongoing conflict in the Middle East, so there might be a possibility of attacking any nuclear station in the region. If we go back to the year 91, around 50 of oil were burnt. And can you imagine if this happens now, what might the consequences be? There are many examples as well, like Saudi Aramco. So, what might have happened if, for example, the attack was targeting a nuclear station or facility? So, there are, of course, incidents that we expect at the level of nuclear facilities, and there are different examples that we can talk about, like the Swedish International Atomic Energy Agency that faced a technical problem at the level of reactors and led to the deterioration of very big parts of the monitoring program. This, in addition to the incidents and attacks, so nuclear energy also creates internal problems, especially in what concerns really. Dealing with nuclear waste. Of course, dumping might be a solution that might be accepted, but this is also a problem because there are no spaces that are secure here in the region, and deep dumping can also really doing this can really affect the resources of life, can pollute the water, and can cause a threat to the food security and the water security. And this was mentioned in the year 2007 in one of the reports. In the end, I would like to say that GCC countries really need to guarantee their energy security and need to know how to use their energy in a sustainable manner at a logical cost. And of course, there are lots of benefits, and the analysis shows that energy security not only focuses on the diversification but also includes different dimensions of security that cover the economic, the environmental, and the political aspects. And if we focus on that, it's important to implement this at the level of the programs of GCC countries. Nuclear energy is of course important, but for example, on the economic level, the cost is high relatively, and it will be higher in the future. On the environmental level, nuclear energy constitutes very big risks, especially because of the small space in the Arab countries. And on the political level, we can say that the existence of a nuclear facility can really create like an encrypted danger for enemies, or a hidden, danger for enemies. And here also we can say that this might have a very negative impact on the region. And based on the analysis, it's very clear that nuclear energy does not have any role to play in what concerns energy security in GCC countries. History shows that there has not been any stability in the Middle East. Energy security, national security actually is not stable, and without this national security we cannot or there cannot be energy security. There's a link between energy security and national security. That's why the existence of nuclear energy in the GCC countries might pose a risk to energy security. Of course, there are positive aspects, but for GCC countries, the objectives that are expected cannot be really reached this easily. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to thank once again the 6th Annual Gulf Studies Forum and the organizers for having given me this opportunity to participate in it. Thank you very much, and now we would like to move to Dr. Nicolai Cousineau, or Professor Nicolai Cousineau. You may take the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. First of all, I would like to thank the Arab Center for this opportunity to be here and to share my views on the topic of the current developments of the Russian-Saudi relations and their impact on the future of the OPEC Plus. But before speaking about this topic, I would like to emphasize that I do not represent here any Russian government or non-government institution. I'm a researcher at the Gulf Studies Center of Qatar University, and all views that are expressed here are purely mine. So the last several years in the Middle East, they became definitely interesting period, the period during which we all saw the change in the system of the regional alliances, or at least in the structure of the international relations of the Gulf and the Middle East. And one of these changes was the creation of so-called OPEC Plus, the coalition of the members of the OPEC and some non-OPEC members who agreed in 2016 on the certain production cuts in order to keep initially oil prices high and now at least stable in the corridor between 50, 60 dollars per barrel. And the leaders of these informal organizations became Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Russia as one of the biggest oil producers in the world. However, this phenomenon of this alliance, it has not been studied thoroughly. First of all, the explanation of why these countries became the leaders of this alliance and why actually they came to an agreement is usually very simplistic. It's just because they needed the high oil prices. Definitely, to a certain extent, this was the case, but it is not the whole story, and moreover, there is a certain political background behind this. Just to draw your attention that within the last several decades, Russia usually preferred to be a free rider, using the decisions of the OPEC to keep oil prices high for its own sake, but without joining this organization or cooperating it in one form or another. And this was the exact policy that Russia was following till roughly 2014, 2015, till the most recent drop in oil prices. For Saudi Arabia, again, if we look back, at least for the last 2 decades, we could see that the strategy was occasionally changing. There were 2 different approaches: the struggle for a market share that implies the low oil prices but the maximization of the output, versus the attempts, periodical attempts to bring the oil prices up. And then suddenly, these 2 countries decided to play roughly within the same field, aiming at the same goal, to keep oil prices high. And there were, from my point of view, 2 main group of reasons for this. One group was purely economic, but related to the domestic consideration and domestic needs of the 2 countries. On the one hand, we saw the change of the ruling members in Saudi Arabia, the rise of King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman. They were accompanied by an attempt to build up, on the one hand, a new, more diversified economy, and on the other hand, to change the social contract within Saudi Arabia that would be reliant more on the creation of the private sector, the additional new jobs, which implied investments, and a part of this plan of diversification and the building up of a new social contract was the IPO of Saudi Aramco. And for these needs, for the maximization of incomes from the private IPO of Saudi Aramco, and for the maximization of volume of money available for the investments in the economy, the Saudi Arabia got extremely interested in high oil prices. Not saying that the additional incomes were needed to fund those undertakings that were taken by the Saudi leadership abroad in Yemen and Saudi involvement in some other regional conflicts. Russia, on its side, were also facing challenges. The economy of Russia came under the sanctions after the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war against Ukraine in the east part of this country, which definitely demanded additional funds to make sure that the Russian economy will be able to make it and to survive the Western pressure, plus to prepare for the year 2024, when we're all expecting the potential changes within the power structure in Russia. Either Putin will step aside and to give his powers to his successor, or there will be changes in the constitution. But the main conclusion is that this year is not going to be safe, stable, and secure for the ruling regime in Russia. So that's why the current budgetary policy is aimed at the maximization of the savings in the Russian budget, which is heavily dependent, first and foremost, on oil incomes, which is in turn also making these countries interested in the maintenance of the high or at least stable oil prices at the international market. The second group of the reasons is directly connected to the wish of improve or to ensure the rapprochement in relations between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And from this point of view, these groups of reasonings, it could be called as purely political. The Saudi Arabia is definitely reassessing its priorities and its interests in the international arena. On the one hand, it sees that the United States' role in the leadership is changing, and this change is demanding from Saudi Arabia the certain diversification of its foreign policies, which makes it interested in Russia, which, as opposed to the US, is trying to demonstrate, to pretend, or even to play the more active role in the region. The Russian involvement itself in the Syrian conflict, its attempts to keep the equally good relations with the main regional players, and thus playing the role of the regional broker, sometimes effective, sometimes not very effective, also makes the Saudi leadership interested in building up and strengthening these relations. And from this point of view, the cooperation within the OPEC Plus, it definitely creates a solid ground, if not the only one solid ground, for the development of the dialogue between the countries. For Russia itself, the importance of Saudi Arabia within the Russian Middle Eastern strategy is quite important, quite huge. Russia hopes that via the active dialogue with the Saudi leadership, it will be able to evade international isolation within the region via building up closer relations with the Saudi partners in the region. It also hopes to have Saudi Arabia on board in the settlement of quite a number of regional tasks in the Middle East that Moscow is pursuing, including the necessity to arrange an endgame in Syria that would suit Russian interests. Not saying about the huge Russian interest in Saudi investments, both in the Russian energy projects inside the country and in the region. Again, like in the case of Saudi Arabia, this makes Russia being very interested in looking for the potential joint ground, for the potential build-up of the close relation with Saudi Arabia. However, one of the main problems is that actually there are only few items where Moscow and Riyadh could find the situation when their interests are overlapping, when their interests could be mutually overlapping, could bring the countries quite close. And from this point of view, their dialogue within the OPEC Plus is becoming one of these few options for them to talk and to discuss. So as a result, again, if we have a look at the dialogue which currently unfolding between these two countries within the OPEC Plus, we could see that sometimes, especially the Russian leadership, is going against certain economic consideration to maintain a good dialogue with the Saudi Arabia and to accommodate the demands of the Saudi side regarding the shaping of the future oil market. However, this dialogue within the OPEC Plus, it has certain limitations. First of all, it is the general market specifics. The OPEC Plus, again, as it's demonstrated by the experience of the last 2 years, is not almighty. It's not able to control all factors that are affecting the global oil markets. Definitely, the current confrontation between the US and China, this economic war, appears to be much more effective in terms of the impact on the oil market than the attempt of the OPEC Plus to cut the production. Not saying that the growing output in the countries which are not a part of this global OPEC Plus deal is also adding severe pressure on the global energy market, decreasing the opportunities and the leverages of Russia and Saudi Arabia, effectiveness of these leverages to achieve the prices, to achieve the high oil prices in the market. And from this point of view, the future of this dialogue between Russia and Saudi Arabia, and especially the future of the Russian interests, in continuing this work with the OPEC Plus will be determined by the fact to what extent this organization will retain its abilities to affect the oil market. The second limitation that exists between these two countries, it's different vision of those goals, priorities, and leverages to be used by the OPEC Plus to achieve the stable oil prices in the market. First of all, Russia is seeking for way lower oil price than Saudi Arabia is. According to the Russian leadership, prices in the current corridor between 50 and 65, 70 US dollars per barrel will more or less satisfy the needs of the Russian economy, whereas the Saudi economy is demanding oil prices far above the $75 per barrel. Secondly, while the Saudi Arabia is actively using its abilities to decrease the production and counts on the physical decrease of oil available in the market, Moscow is more counting on the psychological effects of the periodical statements by the OPEC Plus, and the issue of Russian compliance is periodically pumping up in the international arena, while Saudi Arabia is definitely demonstrating an over compliance with the deal. Moscow is usually trying to keep this level of compliance roughly at the level of 85-90%, which definitely periodically irritates the Saudi partners of Russia and compel them to put the question on why Moscow is not that interested in this loyalty. Not saying that the nature of the oil sectors in Russia and Saudi Arabia is quite different. While the production capacities of Saudi Arabia are allowing this country to play the role of the swing producer that can increase and decrease its oil output within quite a wide range, Russian oil industry is going to experience a very difficult times after 2020. It's officially recognized even by the Kremlin officials that the next decade, if nothing is done by the Russian economists, by the Russian oil company, will be marked by a slow and steady decrease in the capacities of Russian companies to produce oil domestically, which also makes these countries probably less appealing as a partner in the eyes of Saudi Arabia. Finally, there is a growing domestic opposition inside Russia towards the participation in the OPEC Plus deal. The Russian oil majors believe that the current limits imposed on oil production, they are hurting their future development plans, demanding from them every year to reassess the investment plans and to try to limit this program, which also definitely hits their ability to increase the oil output in the future. Not saying that since recently Russian service companies also started to complain due to the lack of the new development projects they definitely are not receiving the same volume of contracts they were receiving previously. Finally, the Russian leadership just a year ago launched a serious tax reform with regard to the oil sector. It was decreasing the taxation base, hoping that this will boost, this will be compensated by the boost in the number of new oil projects implemented in Russia. However, because of the limitations taken by Moscow, it is not happening, which definitely and potentially will decrease the incomes of the Russian budget in the future. To counterbalance these negative sentiments, Moscow previously was using just a traditional carrot and stick strategy, threatening that it can revise certain perks provided to the Russian companies and buying their loyalty via the provision of additional subsidies. But these leverages are also probably not going to be that effectively used as previously. According to the official statistics, almost 50% of oil currently produced by Russia is subsidized. And something that Moscow believes is too much of a good thing, and it's important to either to stop at this level or to reconsider this strategy in the future. So all this creates definitely challenge for the future dialogue between Russia and Saudi Arabia within the OPEC Plus. But that's where you should contradict me saying that just 2 days ago, Moscow and Saudi Arabia successfully came to an agreement that they need to further decrease production output within the OPEC Plus for the next several months, for the next year in 2020. And there is almost no contradiction with what I'm saying. Economically, Moscow is definitely not that motivated to continue this dialogue. Moreover, it agreed to extend this deal only after it managed to secure the exclusion of the liquefied gas received from as a byproduct of the oil production from the deal. So basically, the decrease in the oil output that Russia is going to implement after March 2020 is not going to be as high as it expected. But this was probably the last resort that Moscow could use to make its companies convinced that this deal should be extended. And there is definitely the big question of what's going to happen after the end of the current extension. However, and that's where I would like to bring you back to the beginning of our discussion, there is a serious complex of political factors that make Moscow believe that it's highly important to maintain its participation within the OPEC Plus in order to make sure that its dialogue with Saudi Arabia on a wider topics on the wider range of topics will continue. So in the end, we are receiving a very interesting and unusual situation when basically the economic factors are bringing Russia aside from this deal, but for now the political factors are much stronger in terms of their effects on the Kremlin's consideration that makes Moscow stay as a part of the agreement. And I would say that the chances are high that this deal that was initially be labeled as temporary and was supposed to take less than a year is going to be extended again, and we'll definitely see Russia and Saudi Arabia cooperating on the oil market issues beyond, possibly even beyond 2020. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer your question during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Now I would like to allow the floor for questions. Of course, we can ask for 3 questions in a row before we allow the room for answers. Please go ahead. Microphone. First of all, I would like to thank the two speakers for their presentations. My question is to Dr. Alanoud. You mentioned the strategic need, and you also mentioned the correlation with the conflict in the Middle East. I have a question followed by a comment. My question is, do you think that Israel or some of its backers or some EU countries, do you think they could allow some GCC countries to establish nuclear facilities, whether for peaceful or military purposes? And we already have two failed experiences in Iraq and Syria. My comment is the following. I disagree with you that the nuclear reactor could threaten the Gulf's national security. It could be a key factor to protect our Gulf national security. Actually, we have costs, and we can sustain these costs. The cost of a nuclear reactor in some European countries was less than the cost in our Gulf countries. My other question is to Professor Nikolay.
I reckon that the Salman visit I reckon that Malik Salman, when he visited Russia 2017, marked a cornerstone in his visit. He talked about the cooperation between the two countries. And in the meantime, he talked about the future of OPEC, and the future of economy between those countries. But in the meantime, I think it was a point of decreasing Iran in the region. So what do you think about that point? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will give the floor to Dr. Mohammed Musfir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have long been hearing that GCC countries or countries in the Gulf should not get involved in nuclear energy for military or peaceful purposes. We have long been hearing about this. There are several rumors circulating. There are also several limitations restricting our Gulf countries' capacities. They mention reasons such as culture. We do not have this culture. They also say that the crisis, including the Iran-Iraq war and recently the Aramco attacks and the technical faults in some plants across the region. They also mention the fact that we do not have a vital space for tests, and they believe that we do not have the vital space for tests. But we know that our Ruba Al-Khali desert is greater than many other spaces. We also have vital space for nuclear tests if we want to go down this path. In addition, there are several intimidation attempts trying to discourage us against joining the nuclear club. We are surrounded by 4 nuclear states, including Pakistan and India and Israel. And also Iran is trying to develop its nuclear capacity, and now many are trying to discourage us against nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. They are trying to say that we do not have the capacity and so on. But we know that Iran was able to bring experts from Russia, and back then we were calling for getting experts from Islamic countries that were under the USSR, but no one took our opinion into consideration. In addition, Iraq had its nuclear capacity, and Iran took possession of those Iraqi experts. Some went to Iran, some were killed, and so on. So in my opinion, GCC countries should go down the nuclear path at the level of nuclear and military and peaceful purposes. I believe that the GCC countries should go down this path, because we already have a nuclear armament. We have Iran, we have Pakistan, we have Israel, we have India. So why don't we join this club? We have the human potential, we have the experts, we have the scientists who are possibly studying in US universities, and they can join us. So again, I believe that we should leave this door open, and we should go for nuclear energy for both military and peaceful purposes, and we should not take into consideration any other pretext. Thank you. Shukran, Professor. Of course, there was someone else who wanted to ask his question. Please go ahead, Your Excellency. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would like to thank you for for inviting me to attend this session. I would like to thank you, Professor Alanoud. I do not know if your excellent research had addressed the energy safety, not only energy security, because as you all know, energy security also encompasses a number of elements and factors, including the safe use of energy. Therefore, I believe that we should also focus on this issue, energy safety, that goes beyond energy security. It's true that we repeatedly talk about energy security, but we have another important priority, which is water security. Water security is another priority for us. Electricity should be also used for water desalination in our region. So water security is another important national security priority, and it's a very critical priority. So I would like to know if in your research you have covered the new generation of the smaller reactors. In my opinion, these reactors could play a greater role in the future, but I know this is not a pressing need in current times. As a matter of fact, the modern and the new generation of reactors are of a smaller size, and they could be built in 2 or 3 years. They could be commissioned in 2 or 3 years and not in 18 years. But the problem is that we do not that these reactors cannot be used for a long period of time. Again, I would like to go back to the use of nuclear energy for electricity and for power, and how this could be linked to armament. So I would like to go back to this point to say that, in truth, nuclear energy requires different sets of skills and expertise, and this is different from enrichment. And again, enrichment is something very critical, and also there is another aspect linked to electricity production, and also armament requires different sets of skills and different expertise. So enrichment could lead to peaceful use of energy, and could also lead to a military use if uranium is enrichment to a given higher level. With respect to electricity production, this does not require enrichment. We can buy from any part of the world under long-term contracts. We can buy enriched uranium that is ready to use, and after it's depleted, it could be returned to the supplier. And in this case, we won't have weapons or nuclear energy used for military or armament purposes. And this way, we can produce electricity, and we do not have to worry about other aspects, and we can produce electricity without necessarily developing our enrichment expertise. So I'm wondering if your research has addressed these aspects. These could be ideas for future research. Thank you for your presentation.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you.
طبعا نبدأ هذه المرة.
I will first give the floor to Professor Nicolay.
A question about the role of Iran and marginalizing Iran in the King Salman's visit to Moscow and in the deal between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, the Iranian factor is definitely omnipresent in the Russian foreign policy towards the Middle East and especially within the Russian-Saudi dialogue. But the thing is that while the rapprochement with Saudi Arabia is something which is personally promoted and supported by President Putin, Iran is definitely the ally, the partner of Russia that Moscow has to go for. As it's often joked by the analysts in Russia who are dealing with Iran and with the Russian presence in the Middle East, they are saying that definitely Iran is not a voluntary choice of Russia, but rather a choice determined by the structure of the current international relations in the Middle East. From this point of view, Russia is still considering Saudi Arabia through the prism of the U.S. presence in the region. For Russia, the Saudi Arabia, the kingdom, will always remain as one of the, or at least for now, as one of the important partners and allies of the U.S. So in other way, it will be the country that cannot be completely trusted. In terms of Iran, there are the huge set of issues starting from Syria and ending up the situation in the Caucasus, post-Soviet Central Asia, where Moscow needs its support, Tehran's support, to pursue its political goals. So from this point of view, I cannot say that Iran will ever be a bargaining chip between Riyadh and Moscow. And this is, by the way, very well illustrated by the Russian behavior towards Iran within the OPEC+. The Iranians, while basically profiting again from the outcomes of the deal that helps to maintain relatively stable oil prices, they are constantly complaining about these organizations. They are constantly trying to, at least verbally, undermine its importance. But this is still tolerated by Russia. Moreover, then President Trump took the decision to reintroduce the sanctions limiting the oil output. And Saudi Arabia was supporting the idea that the OPEC Plus should compensate the oil which will be taken from the market. Russia severely opposed this decision because it would be definitely hurting the interests of the Iranians. And moreover, it usually tries to accommodate any contradictions between Iran and Saudi Arabia within the OPEC Plus, trying to play its role as a mediator. So from this point of view, I'm afraid that the Saudi leadership will just need to accommodate the fact that Russia considers Iran as its probably the most loyal ally in the Middle East, while not completely trusting it, while not completely happy about what Iran is doing in the region. But it is not going to reconsider its attitude towards Iran within at least the midterm perspective, definitely.
Thank you very much, Doctor. طبعا دكتورة كان في ثلاث أسئلة.
Doctor, three questions were posed to you. What about Israel's role, or if the political reasons against nuclear reactors? In addition, Professor Misfer asked why Gulf countries do not join the nuclear club, whether for peaceful or military purposes. And also one last question raised by His Excellency the Minister. He said that nuclear energy could be used for electricity production, and he said that this requires different expertise, and this is not linked to enrichment, and that those three elements are different. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, thank you for your questions. I would like to answer the questions in general terms. Before we look into these projects, we need to know that So we need to know that the 1994 agreement reached said that countries going down the nuclear path should share the same geographical space with other countries. They should share water, the space. They should also share with guarantees, and they should provide clarifications also. For instance, in the current Gulf crisis, Barak plant is not acceptable by Qatar. Qatar has its own reservations over Baraka. To date, Qatar has not been provided with any information in the event of any hazard or leak, or in the event of any risk. Qatar has not been provided with information. We do not know, for instance, any information about the black box and so on. In other words, if we want to go down the nuclear path for peaceful purposes, all countries should cooperate hand in hand in the region in order to ensure safety. For instance, in Baraka nuclear plant, if a problem arises, all countries should be advised. But if I do not have relations with the UAE, if Qatar does not have relations with the UAE, what guarantees can Qatar have in relation to its security and safety? In addition, you mentioned intimidation at times. It's true that this energy is used for peaceful purposes, but if we transfer this energy to the region, then the risk lies in armament that can come later, and some countries may choose to start developing and getting nuclear arms. I focused in my research on energy security and nuclear projects, and I did not delve into other aspects. Your Excellency, your ideas are very interesting, and of course they could help me expand my research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I just have two questions that I would like to address to Professor Nikolay regarding Russia. It's important that he mentioned that the Russian oil production will start reducing, as I understood, after the year 2020. I do not know if this will be a motive for the Russians in order for them to focus more on the production of gas, and I would like to understand more about the reasons of this decrease in the Russian oil production after 2020. Can we talk about reasons related to the oil fields? What are the main reasons? Is there no possibility to produce the previous levels? The other thing is the following. I feel that there is a very big opportunistic initiative in the Russian policy in what concerns its relation with alliances and enemies at the same time. So I felt that more than once the Russians said that they were ready to compensate for the share of Iran in the oil market after the American sanctions. So therefore I am among the people who think that the Russians were not very frustrated from the sanctions and also the absence of the quota of Iran will also keep the prices high for Russia. So I do believe that there are common interests, of course, between Russia and between Iran, but at the same time the Russians benefit from every opportunity, even to benefit from the difficulties that their allies might face. I do not know if he has anything to say regarding this. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Hussein Sanad, I am a researcher from Kuwait. I would like to address myself to Professor Alanoud. So, if we take into account the policies of the nuclear policies of France and of Germany after the incident that happened in Japan, in Fukushima, and the nuclear leakage, there were European efforts to consider the nuclear energy as it is not an energy for the future, but it is something from the past. It is an unsafe energy, and so on and so on. Why can't our approach regarding nuclear energy can it be the same? We in the Middle East, we want a clean environment, we want good energy, and in our region, the situation imposes on us sometimes to really adopt a polluting industrial trajectory. So let's focus more on clean energy and so on. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for the second time, Mr. Chairman, for the second time. I think that the reactor of the UAE, of course, that today we are facing a crisis, but it is a crisis like all other crises. However, had there been consensus in such positions, I think that the high leaders should really meet in order to reach objective. Of course, there are now problems with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and with the UAE in what concerns their position regarding nuclear manufacturing or production. However, these are not eternal conflicts that will carry on like what's happening in Israel, in Iran, in India. So in our countries, there are more than 8 million people. Of course, there are political conflicts between the member states of the GCC countries. However, these different conflicts are between countries that have one future, and therefore, of course, there should be a consensus in order to solve these different conflicts, whether the location will be in the UAE or Qatar or KSA or Oman. This is something that is not that important. It's very important to face this armament, and I even can say that maybe Ethiopia later on will join this circle. Let's take all of these things and keep them in mind. Thank you. Thank you very much. Of course, there were two questions to Dr. Alanoud. First, why the Middle East wants to enter this phase, despite the fact that other developed countries are getting out of it. Isn't there any interest in clean energy and the environment? And the other question or the comment by Dr. Misfer also focused on the long-term risk that is more dangerous than the short-term risk regarding the Gulf. Actually, the results of the research show that there's no necessity to have recourse to nuclear energy, and there are really safer alternatives, even if these safer alternatives cannot compete in what concerns the production of electricity. But if we invest in those in a bigger manner, it would be possible to find innovative solutions to these problems and to raise the competition or competitivity. Regarding what Mr. Misfer said, after the crisis in the Gulf, we should ask ourselves what are the guarantees that we have, because the Gulf states during the crisis neglected some of the economic guarantees. So what might guarantee for us in the future that there will be cooperation between the different members? So from this point of view, we do believe that nuclear energy and the political destabilization in the region and the continuous crisis really do not require any sacrifices, especially at this time now. Thank you very much, Professor.
From Dr. Marwan. Do you believe that this decline in oil will lead to an increase in gas? Also, is the reason of the decline in the oil in Russia the drying up of the fields, or are there other reasons? And he also mentioned the opportunism towards Iran, even though it's supposed to be an ally, but he said that Russia rushed to fill in the gap of the Iranian deficit in the market, saying that maybe it views this crisis more as an opportunity than as, in the light of helping its ally. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these questions. I'm afraid if I'm going to answer each of them, we'll be discussing it for more than 2 or 3 hours, especially the question of why Russian oil output is going down. Well, the simplest question is definitely there is a depletion of old oil fields in West Siberia, but it's just the part of the picture. The main problem is that first of all, the oil exploration in Russia was not encouraged by the existing taxation system, by the existing economic conditions, and the last large oil field was commissioned that was commissioned in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. It was discovered during the Soviet times. After that, the major discoveries has not happened in the post-Soviet Russia. The second thing is the effectiveness of oil output. It's not generally high in Russia, so quite a lot of oil is still left underground. The third thing is related to the sanctions. The Russian access to the modern technologies and equipment is severely limited. And that's was something what the Russian political regime is trying to hide, that actually we will feel the effect of sanctions, very negative one, within the next 5 years, when our stockpiles of the equipment that was accumulated before the sanctions will just be finished. And obviously the diversification program that Russia is trying to implement is not very much successful. The new oil fields that could bring certain profit and could add to the oil output production, they are mostly located in the areas with the difficult conditions of extractions. So these requires high prices and government support. Again, something that the Russian budget is not in the situation to provide. It's, by the way, again bringing us back to the Russian dialogue with Saudi Arabia. Shortly before the IPO of Saudi Aramco, there was a report created by the Saudi authorities that the oil output in Russia is extremely expensive, partly mentioning as a part of this report. And this created a very negative reaction in Russia, saying that there was an over-exaggeration of the actual production cost. Yes and no. So if you're taking into account the cost of output at the current oil fields in Russia, in most cases this figure was exaggerated. I guess it was around $40 per barrel, which is too high. But if you take into account the potential production cost in the new oil fields that are located in Arctic, we'll go for figures as high as 60. So which, when put together, definitely giving the roughly the same average that was stated by the Saudi leadership. Not saying that, again, there is a political problem. Large investments in the Russian oil output, they will bring the results roughly by 2022, 2024. And this is the year of unpredictability, the year of power transition in Russia. So there is no large investor in oil sector or outside of this sector who will dare make large investments in the Russian oil sector. In the Russian economy, on average, because the perspectives of the Russian authorities, or the survival of the Russian political regime is not very clear. And that's for which the Kremlin is preparing itself. The strategy of the replacement of the gradual increase of the natural gas as an alternative to oil, they have always been there. But again, the problems are just the same as in case with the oil sector. The lack of technologies, the lack of investments available, and again, the infrastructural issue. Speaking about Iran, yes, in general, I completely agree with you. Russia is pragmatic, Russia is very opportunistic, Russia is not reliable as a partner in the long term, but there are certain shades that I would like, to highlight here. First of all, Russia understands that it needs Iran on quite a number of issues. That's why whenever it's profiting from the sanctions imposed on Iran, it's trying to profit from this situation in a way it won't hurt the general development of its dialogue with Iran. So from this point of view, it was the political bloc of, economic bloc of the Russian government that was saying that we should use this moment to increase the output or use it as an excuse to increase in the output and thus to satisfy the demands of our domestic producers. But political bloc was quite clear that we should not use it. And moreover, I see the chance that could make the political bloc agree with the Russian economists if the disappearance of Iran from the market would rise a prolonged, sustainable rise in oil prices that could theoretically then overheat the market and bring the prices down. But it didn't happen. Basically, what we saw, the hike in oil prices caused by the disappearance of Iran from the market, it lasted, if I'm not mistaken, less than for a week. And it was enough for Moscow to understand that this game is not worth the gains. So that's why the politicians said, no, we need to use. We don't need to use this opportunity to win additional money. But in the longer run, indeed, the current sanctions, they are playing on the Russian interests. Moscow and Moscow companies were always considered as a last resort for the Iranians. They were always giving the preferences to the Westerners, to the Europeans. By the sanctions and the increased pressure of the US on Iran, it naturally pushes the Iranians towards the Russians and the Russian companies and the Russian political influence. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Of course, we would like to thank all speakers and all participants, and we would like to end this session earlier than expected. Thank you very much once again for your presence.